It was a rainy Wednesday morning in February 2019 when everything changed. I was sitting in my cramped Manchester flat, sipping instant coffee, sorting through another stack of rejection emails. My freelance IT work had dried up. The savings were running low. Life had become a cycle of applying, waiting, failing, and repeating. I wasn't looking for miracles anymore. I had stopped believing in them. That's when the call came. "Mr. Fletcher," the voice said politely. "This is Margaret Lane from the firm Harding and Rowe Solicitors. I'm reaching out regarding the estate of your late great Aunt Lillian Richter." I paused. "I'm sorry, who?" It sounded like a scam. I barely knew my extended family, let alone someone named Lillian Richter. My mother never mentioned her, but the woman continued calmly, stating that a relative, apparently the last in her line, had passed away in December. She had no children, no spouse, and her will named me as the sole beneficiary. What she left behind, Wicklow Abbey, a 300-year-old estate nestled deep in the Yorkshire Dales. Even as she spoke the words, I laughed. It felt absurd, like being cast in a period drama by mistake. I was broke, jobless, and barely keeping my phone service active, and now I supposedly owned an ancient abbey in the countryside. Still, I couldn't let it go. I did a quick online search. Sure enough, Wicklow Abbey was real. A grade Roman II listed property, it had stood since the early 1700s. There were a few blurry photos on estate blogs, massive stone towers, sweeping grounds, and a kind of brooding elegance that gave it a Gothic charm. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The solicitor sent me the documents to review. All were in order. Lillian Richter, age 84, had died peacefully in her sleep. The abbey was hers for nearly 50 years. No debts, no pending taxes, just one catch. I had to visit the property within 1 month to finalize the inheritance. I remember sitting on my bed with the papers in hand, heart pounding. Part of me wanted to ignore it. I was a city boy. I didn't know the first thing about owning land or maintaining a centuries-old building. What if it was falling apart? What if it was haunted? Or worse, hiding legal complications? But something deeper stirred in me. It wasn't greed. I wasn't dreaming of turning it into a luxury hotel or flipping it for millions. It was curiosity, a strange, aching pull. I wanted to know who Lillian was, why she had chosen me, what Wicklow Abbey really was. I packed a small bag, borrowed a friend's car, and made the 3-5-hour drive north through winding countryside roads. The deeper I drove into the Dales, the quieter everything became. Mobile signal dropped. Houses grew farther apart, villages vanished into mist, then I saw it. Wicklow Abbey rose from the landscape like a sleeping giant, towering stone spires, moss-covered walls long, forgotten gardens swallowed by weeds. A massive iron gate stood ajar as if waiting. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled into the overgrown driveway. I stepped out and stood in silence. It was majestic, grand, but also lonely. There was no welcome, no caretaker, just an envelope nailed to the front door with my name on it and a heavy iron key inside. As I pushed open the door, the scent of old wood, dried flowers, and time itself hit me. Dust floated in the beams of light that pierced through the stained glass windows. Furniture stood perfectly still. Paintings watched from their frames. A fire had once burned here, but long ago. I remember saying aloud, "This can't be real." But it was. The house was mine, every room, every hidden staircase, every creaky corridor that stretched into darkness. My name was now tied to something far bigger and far older than I could have imagined. In that moment, I thought I had struck a strange kind of luck. But what I didn't know then was that I hadn't just inherited an estate. I had inherited a burden, a question, a secret, and a choice that would change my life forever. The first night I spent at Wicklow Abbey was filled with silence, a silence so complete it became deafening. The kind that presses against your ears like underwater pressure. There were no sounds of passing cars, no humming of streetlights, not even the chirp of a distant bird, just the occasional creak of aged wood and the distant howling of wind through the chimneys. It was as if time had not only slowed here, it had stopped entirely. The next morning I began exploring the abbey room by room. I walked with caution, unsure whether the next step would lead to a cracked floorboard or collapse. But to my surprise, much of it was remarkably well preserved, too well preserved. There were no signs of recent living, No groceries, no modern appliances, no signs that Aunt Lillian had ever installed a television or used email. Yet nothing was decayed, no mold, no rot. The linen smelled faintly of lavender. The clocks, though stopped, were dust-free. Even the candles looked recently dipped. In the grand hall stood a massive grandfather clock, its hands permanently frozen at 2:16. Its pendulum no longer moved, yet I swore I could feel a pulse in the air around it, like a heartbeat too faint to be heard, but impossible to ignore. The more I wondered, the stranger it became. Everything felt untouched, yet unforgotten, like the house was expecting someone to return at any moment. There was a strange blend of elegance and restraint. Every item, from the lace curtains to the silver cutlery in the drawers, seemed chosen with precision. Not luxury, but deliberate presence. Nothing seemed random. I found a writing desk near the library, covered in neatly arranged letters bound with silk ribbon. They were all addressed to the same name, to L.R., but none were signed. The content was deeply personal, philosophical ramblings about sin, light, and the burden of memory. Whoever wrote them had been desperate, pleading for absolution. Behind a locked door in the east wing, I found a small chapel completely intact, with tall stained glass windows of saints and angels. Dust danced in the colored beams like specters in prayer. The altar bore a single black candle that looked like it hadn't melted in decades. I stared at it for a long time, wondering what kind of prayers had been whispered in that space. What kind of soul needed that kind of silence? Wicklow Abbey was not decaying. It was preserved, like something, or someone, wanted it frozen this way. A portrait of a time that no longer existed, and maybe shouldn't have. Later that day, I ventured into what appeared to be Aunt Lillian's private quarters. Her bedroom was immaculate, as if she'd just stepped out to fetch tea and would return any minute. The bed was made, a shawl lay draped over the footboard. On her nightstand, a leather-bound journal waited like a ticking bomb. I flipped it open and found only one entry, dated July 13th, 1992. They warned me not to keep the heart. They said the Abbey would not allow peace until it was returned. But what they don't understand is that the Abbey needs a keeper, and the heart chose me. I hear them at night now, scratching, whispering, watching. I cannot leave, not until the next is chosen. I slammed the journal shut. I didn't know what she meant by the heart, or who they were, but I did know this. I wasn't alone here. That night, the house spoke louder. Doors that I had locked were now open. The air was colder, not just in temperature, but in mood. I heard a woman humming faintly in the corridor as I lay in bed, even though no one else had set foot on the property in years. Footsteps echoed above my room in the attic, where no flooring should have been strong enough to support weight. And again, the clocks remained still. Time at Wicklow Abbey was no longer a servant of reality. It had become a prisoner of memory, looping, waiting, and dragging everything caught inside it into its web. I should have left, packed my bags, and never looked back, but something, maybe that same thing that pulled Lillian in, held me. Because in this place frozen in time, I wasn't just learning about the past. I was becoming part of it. By the fourth day at Wicklow Abbey, I was no longer simply a visitor. I had become a seeker. The questions were multiplying, and with every creaking floorboard and shadow that moved when it shouldn't, I knew something deeper was waiting to be uncovered. I kept circling back to Aunt Lillian's journal, the lone entry about the heart, the warnings, the whispers. What did it mean? Who warned her, and why couldn't she leave? Driven by an urgency I couldn't explain, I scoured her room again. I tore through the drawers, shook out the pillows, and ran my hands behind picture frames. Nothing. The journal's leather cover was dry and cracking, but no other pages had been written in. The entire house was whispering riddles, and then at last one answered. Behind the fireplace in her study, I noticed something odd. One of the stones was smoother than the others. I pressed it. It clicked, a hollow sound. My heart pounded. Slowly, I pushed the panel inward, and a small compartment opened, revealing an older journal, bound in dark green velvet with a golden clasp. It was heavier than it looked, like it carried more than just ink inside. There was no name on the front, just a year 1701. As I opened it, dust spilled out like breath held too long. The ink was faded but still legible. The entries were written in careful, ornate script, a woman's hand most likely. The journal was not a daily record. It was more like a confession or a testimony. The writer, whose name I later learned was Margaretha Wren, had lived in the abbey over 300 years ago when it had functioned as a private convent. But her story was far from holy. She spoke of visions, voices, and an encounter in the east wing, where no altar should ever be built. She wrote, "He came not with horns nor flame, but in the form of beauty, taller than any man, with eyes that gleamed like polished coal. He offered me not power but understanding, and oh, how hungry I was to know the things God would not tell us. My stomach turned as I read more." She had made a pact, a terrible exchange of devotion for unfiltered knowledge. She claimed to have unlocked the secrets of healing, of time, and of the mind's hidden potential, but the cost was her soul. Or so she believed. I hid the heart beneath the altar stone. They said it would beat again when the bloodline returned. Until then, the abbey would keep its silence. Was this what Aunt Lillian meant? The heart, as I flipped through the remaining pages, I began to see a pattern. Every few decades, a new entry appeared, in different handwriting with different voices. But each one referenced the heart, the hidden chamber, and a calling. These people weren't related by blood, but by fate. Each had inherited the abbey, each had been warned, each had stayed, and each had gone mad or vanished. I was now part of this chain. But here's the terrifying part, the most motivating and unsettling truth I uncovered from that journal. None of them started out believing. They were all rational people, scholars, artists, widows, lost souls who thought the abbey was their fresh start. People like me, and slowly, bit by bit, the abbey reprogrammed their minds, not with fear, but with subtle trust. It made them believe they were chosen, that the whispers were messages, that the signs were divine. And that if they just stayed a little longer, they'd find answers. That's how it began with me too. I started waking up at exactly 2:16 a.m. every night, the same time frozen on the grandfather clock. I'd find the pages of the journal open on my desk, even though I never left it there. Candles lit themselves in the chapel. I heard Lillian's voice in the hallway. She called my name gently like a lullaby, but reading the journal did something they hadn't counted on. It shook me awake. For the first time, I understood the abbey wasn't just haunted by spirits. It was haunted by choices, by souls who willingly surrendered their peace for understanding, their sanity for secrets, and I had a choice too. The journal didn't just change my understanding, it challenged my purpose. Why was I here? What would I choose? Would I run? Would I stay? Would I finish what they all started? Or break the chain? Some inherit houses. Some inherit wealth. I inherited a warning wrapped in velvet and stitched with centuries of silence, and now I knew, whatever lived beneath the abbey had waited long enough. It began with a single decision. I needed to see what was under the abbey. The journal had all but confirmed it. There was something hidden beneath the East Wing Chapel, something that generations had whispered about but never survived long enough to fully expose. Every instinct inside me screamed to walk away, to take the journal and leave Wicklow Abbey forever. But I couldn't, because now I knew, and knowing demanded action. Curiosity is a strange beast. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It weaves itself into your bloodstream until you start seeing answers in every shadow, believing there's meaning in every noise. That's what happened to me. I wasn't possessed. I was obsessed, and obsession is far more dangerous because it wears your face. I returned to the chapel at midnight, just as Margaretha Wren's journal instructed. I brought nothing but a flashlight, the journal, and the skeleton key I had found hidden in Aunt Lillian's drawer, wrapped in black cloth, warm to the touch like it had been waiting. The stone altar was exactly as described. Cracked, uneven, and cold even though the room wasn't. I knelt beside it and pressed the key into a small hole carved beneath the edge. Something shifted, the floor groaned, and then it moved. With an echo that seemed to come from deep beneath the earth, a section of stone slid away, revealing a staircase descending into blackness. The air that rose from below didn't smell of rot or death. It smelled clean, too clean, like sterility, like something trying too hard to hide its true nature. I had come this far, I couldn't turn back. As I descended, the silence was deafening. My own heartbeat became thunder in my ears. I passed through narrow tunnels lined with old stone and iron sconces. Then I reached a chamber, oval, domed, ancient, and in its center, on a stone pedestal, something pulsed. It wasn't beating like a heart, but it was alive. Somehow. The object was the size of a grapefruit, wrapped in old linen and sealed with iron clasps. The journal called it the heart, but standing there in front of it, I realized it wasn't symbolic. It was literal. I don't know what compelled me to touch it, but the moment I did, everything changed. I was hit with a vision, not a dream, not a memory, but something outside time itself. I saw Margaretha Wren, sobbing as she sealed this chamber. I saw men in black robes chanting, offering their blood. I saw my Aunt Lillian screaming into the dark, her hands pressed against the very stone altar I had just moved. And then I saw myself, older, worn, alone, and whispering to someone who wasn't there. I pulled my hand away and fell backward, gasping, but something stayed with me, a feeling like part of me had been rewired, like I had inherited more than just a building. I had inherited a burden. That's the cost of curiosity. You don't just find answers. You pay for them with your peace. You give up the luxury of pretending the world is simple, that evil is just a story. Once you open a door like this, you can't close it. I returned to the surface, trembling. I didn't speak to anyone. I barely ate. I couldn't sleep. My dreams were full of whispers. My name repeated endlessly like a song I couldn't forget. I saw rooms in the abbey I hadn't discovered yet. I felt drawn to corners I had never noticed before. The building had opened up to me, but not like a friend, like a jealous guardian. The truth is, no one warned me that knowledge comes with a price tag in blood and mind. Aunt Lillian's journal wasn't a guide. It was a grave marker. And mine might be next. People think horror lies in what we don't understand, but that's only half true. The real horror is in the moment we do, because once you know the truth, you can't unknow it, and it stares back at you every time you blink. I had gone looking for answers. I found them, but they didn't free me. They chained me to something far older, far darker, and far more patient than anything I'd ever believed in. Now every step I take in the abbey feels watched. Every mirror reflects things that shouldn't be there, and every night, that heartbeat beneath the chapel grows stronger. That's what curiosity costs. It doesn't kill you all at once. It just takes you piece by piece, until you don't recognize yourself anymore. For weeks after I uncovered the chamber beneath the abbey, I lived in a haze, a slow spiral between fascination and fear. I walked the halls of that vast, crumbling place like a ghost among the ruins. The stained glass no longer glowed with beauty but flickered like watching eyes. The stone walls, once silent, seemed to breathe, and every night, without fail, the whispering began. At first, I convinced myself it was stress, maybe even a psychological response to being so isolated in an ancient building far from any city or village. But deep down, I knew better. The abbey wasn't reacting to me because it was haunted. It was reacting to me because it recognized me. I had unlocked something, and it had unlocked me. The deeper I read through Margaretha Wren's journal, and the other documents hidden in locked drawers and false shelves, the more the pieces began to fit together. Wicklow Abbey wasn't just a monastery, nor was it merely a noble estate. It was a gate, and each generation of my family had been its keeper. My aunt had written about the charge. She never called it a curse or a blessing. It was just the charge, a duty passed from blood to blood, each heir receiving the key and the knowledge when the last one passed away. I hadn't just inherited property and secrets, I had inherited a role. One that bound me to something ancient, hungry, and very much alive. Margaretha's writings described the abbey as a vessel, a place built not only of stone but of intention. Every arch, every chamber, every piece of carved wood was part of a containment system. Beneath it all, under the eastern wing, the heart was the source, the center of power that couldn't be destroyed, only subdued, and the bloodline, that was the final seal. The family line had to remain intact because we were the last barrier between it and the world outside. That's when the dreams became something more, not dreams, visitations. I began waking up in rooms I didn't fall asleep in. I heard voices calling my name from inside the walls. Old portraits would fall to the floor just before I entered the room, revealing markings behind them. Glyphs burned into stone centuries ago. The abbey wasn't deteriorating. It was responding, shifting, almost reawakening. The realization hit me hard one morning. I stood before a tall mirror in the abbey's north hallway, and my reflection didn't move. I did, but the figure in the mirror stayed perfectly still for 2 full seconds, staring directly at me. I screamed, the figure blinked, then it was gone. From that moment on, I understood. The abbey didn't just need a caretaker, it needed a host. Each heir once chosen would slowly be claimed, not killed but consumed. Their will would fade, their soul fray at the edges, until eventually they became part of the abbey itself. That's why Aunt Lillian had never left. That's why no one ever passed the abbey on to a living heir. It waited until death, because death was the final handover. That's what I had inherited, not land, not riches, not a mystery to solve or a building to restore. I had inherited a sentence, and it terrified me. But here's where things became complicated. I began to feel protective of the place. The abbey was becoming part of me, yes, but I was becoming part of it too. I knew which floorboards would creak before I stepped on them. I could find my way through the candle-lit corridors blindfolded. I could sense when someone was outside before the doorbell rang. The abbey had chosen me, and now, whether I liked it or not, I was changing. I had always thought that evil was something outside of us, something we fought against. But what if it was something that lived within, patiently waiting for an invitation? That's the true weight of inheritance. Sometimes, the legacy passed down isn't wealth or honor, it's a contract. An ancient one written not on paper but into the very marrow of your bones. And once you sign it, knowingly or not, you become something else entirely. I stood in the chapel days later, looking at the altar where it all began. The stained glass cast fractured colors across the stone. I could feel the abbey watching me, not with menace, but expectation. I finally understood. The abbey didn't need to be feared. It needed to be remembered. It needed to be kept, and now I was its keeper, not because I wanted to be, because I had no choice. The abbey had taken everything from me, or maybe, in truth, I had given it all willingly, piece by piece, without even realizing it. First came my time, then my thoughts, then my sleep, and finally my sense of who I was before I arrived. I had become a keeper of something ancient and secretive, yes, but at what cost? I was no longer the person who first stood at its massive oak door, keys trembling in hand, full of naive curiosity and half-expectant wonder. That person had disappeared somewhere between the hidden stairwells and the whispering halls. I had inherited a legacy I never asked for, and now I had to make a decision that no one before me had dared to make, to break the cycle. But letting go wasn't as simple as walking away. The abbey didn't have locks that could be turned from the outside. It had roots in your soul. I began to understand that with every keeper it consumed, it grew stronger, its consciousness more defined, its hunger more precise. But it also grew dependent on us, like a parasite that cannot live without its host. We gave it meaning, we gave it life. It was a home, yes, but also a prison of spirits and intention, and I had been the latest brick in its cursed architecture. I began to ask myself, what if freedom isn't found in escape, but in surrendering the right thing? So I started letting go, little by little. First, I stopped reading the journals, the ones that had consumed my nights, the ones that felt like sacred texts. I closed them one by one and locked them in the cabinet under the chapel pew. And when I walked away, something in the air grew tense. The abbey noticed. Then I stopped lighting candles in the inner chambers. I left rooms untouched. I no longer listened to the whispering walls or obeyed the feelings that told me to go here or there. I refused the guidance. I defied the pull, and that's when it started retaliating. One night, I woke up gasping for breath. The room was filled with the smell of smoke, though there was no fire. My journals had been pulled from their hiding place and scattered around me in a perfect circle. My aunt's portrait had fallen from the wall, split clean down the middle. It wasn't just haunting me now, it was begging me to resume my role, but I was no longer that person. I didn't belong to the abbey. I never had. The final test came when I stood before the cellar door again. The same door I had found during my first weeks there, the one I swore never to open a second time. I knew what lay behind it, the source, the heart, the pulse that beat in silence beneath the stone floor. I took the key from my pocket. The brass was warm, as if it had its own heartbeat. I could hear the low thrum behind the door, like the slow breath of a slumbering beast. I could walk in and become it. Let it take me as it had taken those before me. It would be easy, peaceful even, like surrendering to sleep. But instead, I dropped the key on the floor. I walked out. I didn't pack a single bag. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't turn back to lock the gate. I just left. I hiked the narrow forest trail for hours, until the mossy stones of the abbey were no longer visible behind the trees. My legs ached. My lungs burned. But my heart, my soul, felt light for the first time in months. There's something poetic about release. It's not loud. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It's quiet. It happens in the small, final choices. The ones that say no more. The ones that reclaim your voice, your mind, your purpose. I realized that legacy isn't about what you inherit. It's about what you choose to continue or break. I broke it. And in doing so, I broke the abbey's hold. Yes, it still stands. Somewhere in the woods of northern England, the abbey waits. Maybe for another heir, maybe for someone curious enough to go digging. But it will no longer take from me. It can no longer command me. I have scars, I have questions, but I also have freedom. Letting go wasn't abandonment, it was redemption, and sometimes the only way to truly be free is to walk away from what wants to own your soul. Moral of the story: we often chase legacy, wealth, and family pride without ever asking what built this, or who paid the price before me. Wicklow Abbey didn't take my soul. I gave it away the moment I ignored what it stood for. But I took it back the day I walked away.